This woman on the screen, she is not what she seems. They called her the most evil woman in the history of mankind. A full-time abbess, Maryam Solicitis. For decades, she deceived everyone around her with a facade of piety, all for the intoxicating allure of money and power. By the end of her reign, Maryam would be exposed as a monster and known as the non-serial killer. This isn't a horror movie script. It's a terrifyingly real story. 1883, rural Greece. Maryam Solicitis is born into poverty, her life seemingly predetermined by the hardscrabble existence of her family farm. She had a hunger, an ambition that far surpassed her humble surroundings. Some say she worked in a factory, toiling for daily wages. Imagine waking up before dawn, a simple breakfast, maybe nothing at all, depending on what the farm could provide. But even in the fields and factories, the seeds of a formidable personality were being sown. Marina knew there was another path. Marina chose the path that could fulfill her ambition. She became a nun, joining the old calendarist church. Then she met Matthew Karpathakis, the head monk, a man alienated from the old church's teachings. He decided to form his own sect, the new calendarist church. Marina joined him. Marina became Maryam Solicitis. No one could have predicted that this woman, who took the pure name of Maryam, would soon bring terror upon the very people who followed and believed in the church. Maryam quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a confidant of Matthew. Together they built the Panagia Theotokos Monastery, or Convent of the Virgin in the Pines. In 1927, located between Kirtaya and Kakethulsa. On the surface, this new monastery was to honor the Virgin Mary, but in reality, it was a means to gather funds for the new movement. Matthew and Maryam were masters of deception, presenting themselves as the faces of honesty, faith, and integrity. They used faith as a tool to manipulate the innocent people who believed in them, but their true intentions were far from divine. Building a monastery is no small feat, but where did the resources come from? None of the founding nuns came from money. It was a miracle, or it seemed that way. The truth was far more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. The monastery was advertised as a healing center for tuberculosis. People, desperate for a cure, flocked there. Maryam welcomed them with open arms, settling multiple patients in single rooms and preventing doctors from visiting. All she needed was a signed death certificate. This negligence would have gone unnoticed if Maryam hadn't started another disturbing practice. While Matthew embarked on a spiritual journey, isolating himself and fasting for 40 days with heavy metal chains tied around his waist, his apprentice, the seemingly sweet Maryam, began to impose her own tyrannical rule. Her ambition was clear: to amass as much wealth as possible for her monastery by any means necessary. By the time Matthew was on his deathbed, Maryam had already seized control. She snuffed out all attempts to heal the rift with the old church and solidified her power. Finally, after 11 years, Maryam was named Mother Miriam of Kiritu. Her lifelong ambition was complete, the abbess of the Theotokos Monastery. She wore the black veil as a crown, a sign of power and a reflection of her true intentions. Soon, she began her ascetic practices. Her strong character had evolved into something formidable, a ruthless force. The media dubbed her Mother Rasputin. Donations. They may seem like the most humane act one can perform, but what if they are based on fear? That is exactly what Maryam did. Her crimes far exceeded illegal imports. She destroyed lives under the guise of treating patients with tuberculosis. She tortured, blackmailed, and extorted, using faith as her weapon. Families were trapped, bound, and tortured until they surrendered everything. At least 27 murders were attributed to Maryam, but the true number was likely much higher. Mr. and Mrs. Becker, devoted followers of the calendarist church, were drawn to the monastery by their mentor. Mrs. Becker, having already pledged her property, tried to leave when she realized Maryam's cruelty. This opportunity was too good to be missed, so Maryam locked her in a cell where patients with tuberculosis had died. Mrs. Becker's cries went unanswered in the mountain monastery. When Maryam finally released her, she fell into a coma. Maryam let her die, Rotting in the prison she called a monastery, Mr. Becker suffered the same fate and died a painful, lonely death. Mr. and Mrs. Panayotopoulou were not so lucky. They were starved until they signed their property over to Maryam. Once their wealth was secured, Maryam decided they had no use in this world. Miss Mikalaku, diagnosed with TB, was horrified when she found herself locked in a cell with no medicine and only tiny nails as food. She suffered the same brutal death. When Sister Theodote spoke out against Maryam, she was beaten to death. Sister Maria suffered the same fate when she too dared to defy Maryam. Anyone who opposed Mother Rasputin faced her wrath. The church denied any involvement in the murders, but the truth was undeniable. Maryam lured innocent people with the promise of salvation, only to lock them in basements and force them to transfer their property. Maryam's crimes went undetected for so long because no one could believe that a nun could be capable of such villainy. Maryam sent monks across Greece in search of wealthy spinsters, widows, and families. She lured them into donating to the monastery and then stole their possessions. But her reign of terror would soon come to an end. The police received an anonymous tip about an elderly woman forced to pledge all her property to the monastery. The police started investigating. They soon realized Maryam was involved in the illegal import of olive oil and other spices. But it wasn't until Eugenia Marghetta came forward, stating she was held captive and tortured to give away property worth 118 million, that Maryam's crimes finally began to unravel. 1949, Christos Spirites searched for his missing daughter. The trail led the FBI to the monastery. It was the beginning of the end for Mother Rasputin. On the night of December 4th, 1950, 85 police officers stormed the monastery with a judge and coroner. They rescued 36 children, half-naked, malnourished elderly women, sick and chained in basements. Maryam's true nature was finally revealed. Maryam's trials were a spectacle. She continued to portray herself as a pious nun while rejecting all charges as satanic fictions. The Matthewites were outlawed in 1951. Maryam could no longer hide behind the veil of religion. The prosecutor did not hold back a single detail of her monstrous deeds. Maryam was charged with homicide, fraud, forgery, blackmail, and torture. Maryam stood in court like a heartless monster, crossing herself and praying to St. Matthew, oblivious to the depth of her depravity. Maryam received 3 separate sentences: 26 months after her first trial, 10 years after the second, and 4 consecutive months after the last. The total length of her sentence was 14 years, but she only spent a year in prison before falling ill. At the age of 71, Maryam Solicitis died in a hospital as isolated as her victims, but without the same horrific end. Maryam left behind 400 followers. Almost 500 people had given away their property to the monastery. The Matthewites continued to revere Maryam as their true saint, claiming the male priests were jealous of her success. They believed the hundreds of deaths were God's will, not negligence. Nina Kultaki describes this story as a vindictive nature. Carrie Seagrave estimated her victims to be 177. But at the end, the most important thing is that you don't forget to watch my previous and upcoming episodes. Like this video if you dare, share it if you care, and subscribe to the channel to show you're aware. See you in the next episode.